Good evening and welcome to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries here in what is today sunny Latonia. You know, I've been saying that introductory spiel, if you will, for a great many years. Sometimes when I'm preparing this program, I just realize how long it's been going and what we've talked about it. And I must really turn the volume down on my little electronic masterpiece here, so you don't hear that sound. We talked last week, and I explained that we'd had a bit of a sabbatical, and we're showing some of the earlier Bible Speaks programs as a way of catching our breath. You know, ministers and teachers and artists and musicians do this sabbatical thing where they go away and sort of, you know, refresh their thoughts and ideas and this sort of thing. And for some 15 or 18 years we've been doing this program and not really, other than normal vacations and things, haven't really taken a break. And as you get older, and we all get older of course, you suddenly realize it takes you a little longer to come up with or to research ideas, and then you look at things you've done in the past. I keep all my scripts I keep in a file and on a computer, and I go back and look at the old ones sometimes for ideas, or we talk about that once before, and you realize how many things have changed over the past 15-20 years as far as Bible research goes, Bible archaeology and that sort of thing. So as I mentioned last week, we sort of skipped around the subject a bit, but we're going to go and do this Who Wrote the Bible, and I made a note here and I called it second edition. That was so I could tell it from the first one I did some 10 or 12 years ago. And maybe we'll do a little more detail this time. I thought we were fairly detailed last time, but going back and looking at some of the older programs, and we've got them all on DVD here, I realized that we kind of rushed through one or two areas, possibly because either I didn't research it enough, or I thought perhaps it was too in-depth for what we were doing with the program. We shall see. And for those of you who are technically inclined, I'm doing this on a Samsung tablet, but having been bitten once or twice in the past, I also have a paper script here, so if I suddenly reach for it, you'll know something's gone wrong electronically. And I apologize for my voice. It seems that if I am active during the day for anything longer than 3 or 4 hours, my voice gets a bit strange. Perhaps I should stop talking, eh? Anyway, the Bible's, who wrote the Bible? Well, there's 50 million different theories out there, I'm sure there is, but let's look at some background first of all before we kind of get into it. You know, we've had the Bible, or physically had the Bible, for over 2,000 years. It is, I'm told, and I did some research to verify it, there are more copies of the Bible in or out of print. There have been more copies, is that the right word, of the Bible than any other book in existence, including, I might add, the Quran. And the Quran is a fairly prolific book. It's been quoted and misquoted by just about everybody, good, bad, or indifferent. It is considered a great work of literature, like Shakespeare's works and other people's writings, so it's a literary work. It is by some people considered to be the first work of history. In other words, if you read what we call the Old Testament, it reads like a historical novel, a historical account, and that wasn't something people did very much back in those days. Of course, the Bible's the heart of Christianity and Judaism, and if you look very closely, some of the principles of the Bible are reflected in other teachings, in Islam and in other religions. A lot of the principles will be found there. Okay? Ministers preach it, of course, that's what their job is. Scholars study it. And what's interesting is in the last few centuries, since about the 1800s, Bible study, scholars studying the Bible, has become one of the most prolific areas of study. I mean, we have, whereas in universities 20 years ago there were a few Bible courses, if you will, nowadays any university or seat of higher learning worth its salt has a pretty full-fledged Bible degree of some sort, or religious degree of some sort. So it's in use constantly. And of course people read it. People like you and I read it. At least I hope we do. Some people keep it on the shelf and dust the dust off every so often, but a lot of people read it. Most of us, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes knowingly, and sometimes just by sheer habit, quote the Bible in our daily conversation. So the Bible is, you can't, if you go about your normal life, but be you a Christian or be you a non-Christian, or be you an atheist even, you can't escape from the fact that the Bible permeates all of life. It simply does, whether you want it to or not. We write about it, we argue about it, we take stands. Great, religions are formed by one angle or another angle of the Bible. People adopt attitudes towards other people because of what the Bible says. It's amazing. And yet, most of us, in fact nearly all of us, except for a few scholars, have absolutely no idea who wrote it and how it got put together. Oh, we have a little bit. We know that probably David wrote some of the Psalms, and maybe Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, okay? And Moses didn't write the first 5 books, by the way. I mentioned that last week. So if you've got your stones and your tar and your feathers handy, now would be a good time to break them out. But it didn't happen. And that's assuming all the things that we know about, or we think we know about, are true, What's interesting about Bible study is that it didn't develop as religion versus science. It wasn't a competition. In fact, the early Bible scholars, the early Bible students, the people who started to look at it and say, well, where does this mean? What does this mean? And where does it come from? Were in fact the clergy. Principally because only the clergy could read it. I mean, you have to understand that whilst we've had the Bible for some 2,000 years, it hasn't always been able to be read by the ordinary people like you and I for that great length of time. For most of the time, we the ordinary people, didn't read it. We heard it read to us by clergy who were educated, some of them. We won't go into it. I could do a whole series of programs on how badly educated the clergy in England were during the times of the Reformation and that sort of thing. But anyway, that's another thing, okay? The thing is, you can't recognize the Bible's impact. You can't acknowledge the fact that it has an impact on daily life without kind of caring where it came from. I mean, if it's a great work of literature, then who are the artists? Who are the people who wrote it? If it's a study in history, whose reports is it based on? If our knowledge of the Middle East in what is really the Bronze Age, who wrote the reports? Was it archaeologists? Was it Scientologists? Was it paleontologists? Whatever they call them. Anyway, who wrote the laws? I mean, where'd the laws come from? And who fashioned the book that we know as the Bible from a collection, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but from a collection of stories and poetry and laws. Whose idea, who's had the concept of putting it all together into one single book. And there is little or no, I'll tell you this before we go into it, there's little or no obvious indication of authorship. To find out who possibly wrote this or that, we have to do some really in-depth studying. And I know some of you say, well, I don't want to know all that. I just accept the Bible as it is. And that's your privilege. For me personally, and I hope for some of you watching and listening, that you'd like to know more about this one piece of our faith that everybody ties everybody together, and yet really we don't know that much about. I'll reiterate for those staunch fundamental people, shall we say, that the Bible is an inspired word. I don't have any problem with that. I do think that it was put together by people, men like you and I do think that it is not an object of worship. I don't think the Bible was, and never was intended to be, an object of worship. It is a guide, it is a refuge, it is an inspiration, it is a comfort. But we don't worship a God. As I said last week, and I'll say it every week we do this, we worship a risen Christ, not a Bible. The Bible helps us to understand what it is that the risen Christ would like us to be and do. And I'm all for that. But let's not get mistaken with this. It's any more than we should worship a crucifix. I mean, I know my Catholic brethren are going to be all over me on this one, because it is obviously the cross is the most obvious feature in most Christian churches. And yet we don't worship the cross. We acknowledge the sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross, but we don't worship it, or we shouldn't do. An object of reverence, yes. An object of veneration, I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think we should fix our sights on God and on the Son of God, Jesus Christ, to figure out where we should be going. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much, you know. As I said, we don't know who wrote it, or where the background information came from or anything. And sometimes the text of the Bible cannot be understood really without that sort of information. For example, how can I say this? Did a particular author, did a particular writer in one part of the Bible or the other, and I'm jumping a little ahead here, but live in the 8th century BC or in the 5th century BC? And you say, well, does it really matter? Well, yes, it does, because do the words mean the same in the 8th century as they did in the 5th century, as they do in the 5th century? Don't forget, the 8th century being older. And you can see that with the way the English or the American language, whichever you choose to take, has changed over the years. And words we use today meant something different some years ago, just in a few years. I mean, let's take one word, for example, and I'm not opening up a can of worms with this. Take the word gay. All right? It used to be a girl's name. Most famous one I can think of is the mother or the grandmother, I'm not sure. I think it's the mother of Colonel Tibbets, who flew the B-29 that dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima. Or Hiroshima, I should say. It was called the Enola Gay, after his mother. It was a name. It was an attitude. You know, Zorro the Gay Blade. It doesn't mean that today, does it? Well, it does, but it means something else. You know, if somebody said, "Oh, I'm feeling really gay today," they'd get cross, funny looks, and people would step aside and walk around them. But back 20 years ago, even before then, in fact, in my early youth, the word "gay" meant just that: gay, happy, and gay. You go back and look at the old songs; the word "gay's" in there all the time. But as I'm saying, so. If a writer is writing about something and uses the word gay, did he mean it in the sense here in 1950? Or does he mean it in the sense now, in 2016? And yes, I was alive in 1952. You work it out. But you see what I'm saying? So it is important. Was the writer, or the intended writer, was he a witness to the acts that are in the Bible, or was it through written stories, old family stories, oral accounts? You remember I mentioned last week about the Roots book, Arthur Haley's book about the Roots, where the African tribes had a person whose job it was to remember everything that happened, to be able to sort of, what happened in July 10 years ago? Well, that's when Chief so-and-so did this, because they had no way of writing it down, so they communicated that way. Much as the people in the Middle East back in the Bronze Age did the same thing. Was the Bible even written as a sacred text? Were the writers, whoever they are, and we're going to discover that later, were they saying, this is going to be a sacred text, I've got to write this in such a way as people living in thousands of years ahead will understand that this is a sacred text? Or were they merely saying it like it is? Were they really putting down, does a preacher preach a sermon on a Sunday to enlighten the people in the church, to impart some sort of message to them about whatever the subject of the sermon is? Or is he saying it so that it will be recorded and for future generations will come to look upon the words? I think the former, don't you? It's intended for the time. If you read the Old Testament, if you read Jeremiah, if you read Isaiah, they're not intended for, although we certainly use them for, they're not intended for this particular generation. They were intended for what was happening at the time. Okay. So, let's get a little bit into it. The first 5 books of Moses, let's talk about those for a minute. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, all those. Early tradition says Moses wrote them. Okay, well, okay, I've already said, and so many scholars will say that not so. But we won't just say that and walk away from it. We'll go into that. First of all, anyone who's read the first 5 books, and other than having them quoted in Sunday school or during church services, if you sit down and read them, they are extremely difficult to follow. Events that happen in one particular sequence of time are followed very shortly in the same book or the same chapter, the same events in a different order. A follows B follows C, and then later on B follows A follows C. It goes all over the place. Sometimes 2 of something is mentioned. 2 of the sheep did this, and then a little later on 12 of the sheep did this. So, who's right, who's wrong? And you'll see where I'm going to with this as we develop it over the weeks, right? I mean, the Moabites did one thing. The Moabites rose up and did this, right? And then, the next chapter, it's the Midianites who did it. No, are they the same people, different time, different place? Very difficult to understand. And then the other thing about Moses writing these first 5 books is that there are things in them that Moses could not even have known about. I mean, one of the things it's very difficult to do, unless heavenly creatures have more insight into things than I'm aware of, is to have knowledge of what happens after you die. I mean, you can like to think what happens after you die. You're remembered as a great whatever it is you want to be remembered as. But events that happen, whether the Reds won the series the year after you died, is not something you would know about and be able to write down ahead of time, unless your name's Nostradamus or something like that. And even he was a bit vague. But eventually, what happened is that the scholars generally decided that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, was written long after Moses. In fact, a gentleman called Richard Simon in about 1688, 89, something like that, who was one of the first people to publish a exercise on the Bible and how it came to be. He theorized that whoever put it together had at their disposal old stories from here and there, and tribal legends and this sort of thing from all over the place. And they're known as, the theory he presented was the source theory. Okay, where did it come? It came from different sources. And that's why this source over here says 2, and this source over here said, no, there were 12. And this says cows, and that says sheep. It's different sources. It's like, if I oversimplify it, it's as, the old eyewitness thing. You have something happen, like a car accident happens on the corner at Riddy's Corner outside the church here, and you get 12 people who saw it. They're all standing around the corner, and they saw it happen. And you go to each one of them and say, okay, so what happens? So the red car hit the blue car in the middle of the intersection. No. The blue car was actually moving and hit the red car, and it wasn't in the middle, it was over there. Every one of those people will have a different viewpoint on what actually happened, and so we have 12 different sources. That oversimplifies it, but I'm sure you know what I mean. And the 5 books of the Pentateuch show very obvious signs of where these sources have been put together. And in fact, they narrowed it down, by process of elimination, style of writing, references, that sort of thing, that there were probably just 2 main, not saying there weren't any others, but main sources of information that was used to put the 2 books together. Anyway, so that became the hypothesis, if you will, of the scholars kind of adopted. Okay, that's what we think happened. Let's see what we can do to prove that and go into it. The one thing you have to understand too is that any form of any form of investigation, and I use the word investigation literally, not trying to prove something's wrong, or necessarily trying to prove something's right, but just trying to prove how something came to be. Any investigation was totally criticized or damned and really caused a great deal of problems by the religious authorities of the day. I mean, nobody likes to have their precious beliefs and theories criticized, I mean, look at us with our politics, Democrats believe that they're right and their policy is great and get furious when people say, no, you're all wet. And the Republicans feel that they've got a handle on everything and get really upset when somebody says you've got it all wrong. People don't like that. They'd rather content with, I know what I know, leave me alone, that's all I want to know. Okay? And that persists until today. I mean, even today, in-depth Bible scholars are looked upon with great suspicion by the major churches. They are. There's no 2 ways about it. I mean, if this guy is investigating, for example, there's a book. It's a novel. What's it called? The Templar Legacy. I'm not advertising it. And it's about how the Templars, who were the Knights Templar back in the 1300s, 1500s, who were almost wiped out by Philip II of Spain in about 13-something. Anyway, their job originally was to guard the pilgrims to the Holy Land, protect them from harm initially. But it was supposed that they had information that disproved the resurrection of Christ. And that's how they became very powerful, because the church did not want that sort of thing to get out and about with people, so it behooved them to support the Templars and let them do whatever they needed to do in their job. It's long and involved, but it just shows you that the sort, and it's a novel, not necessarily historically factual, but it gives you the idea of how people didn't want their comfortable beliefs disturbed. Okay, and in the 20th century, of course, things changed a lot. In fact, in about 1943, the current Pope put out they call them encyclical letters, whatever it is, put out a letter which encouraged people to study the Bible and find out why this was written, who wrote it, what it was intended for at the time and what it means to us today, and that sort of thing. Encyclical, that's it, an encyclical letter. Okay, which is remarkable because up until then, the fiercest opposition to any sort of Bible study, any Bible criticism at all, was the Catholic Church. They just flat out were against it. But as I said, the Pope in those days encouraged scholars to pursue the knowledge of the Bible. One of the interesting things it says in his letter is that, and I quote it says that the interpreters determine the peculiar character and the circumstances of the writer and the age he lived in. In other words, what was happening at the time, why did the guy write about it, and what influenced the way he wrote. And so we're running out of time here, but that's what we'll get into next week. Why things are written the way they were, who possibly put it together, and that sort of thing. It's a fascinating book. It's going to make some fascinating study for us. Until next week then, from me, Tony Baxter, and all of us here at LBC Television Ministries, good night and God bless you.